There are moments in history when a single piece of geography becomes the fulcrum upon which entire geopolitical strategies pivot. The Suez Canal in 1956, the Strait of Hormuz during the oil shocks, Taiwan today, and now in a development that's reshaping strategic calculations from Washington to Beijing, we have Greenland, a frozen landmass that most Americans couldn't locate on a map, yet one that may determine whether the United States maintains its position as the world's preeminent power or watches it slip away to rivals who've been quietly positioning themselves for decades. Let's establish what we're actually discussing here. Greenland isn't just the world's largest island. It's 836,000 square miles of Arctic territory sitting at the intersection of North America and Europe, positioned directly along the shortest routes between the continental United States and potential adversaries. Currently, it's an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, home to roughly 57,000 people, and until recently, it was considered a geopolitical backwater. Expensive to maintain, strategically interesting in an abstract Cold War sense, but hardly the center of anyone's grand strategy. That calculus has fundamentally changed, and the reasons why tell us everything we need to know about the emerging resource wars of the 21st century. When Donald Trump suggested in 2019 that the United States should consider purchasing Greenland, the reaction was predictable. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called the idea absurd. International media treated it as another Trumpian eccentricity. Editorial boards rolled their eyes. But here's what the dismissive commentary missed. Trump was articulating out loud what defense strategists, resource economists, and intelligence analysts had been discussing in classified briefings for years. The president just said the quiet part loud. Because beneath Greenland's ice sheet, which covers roughly 80% of the island and contains enough frozen water to raise global sea levels by 24 feet if it melted, lies one of the richest concentrations of rare earth elements anywhere on the planet. We're talking about neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. If those names mean nothing to you, understand this. These are the materials that make modern technology possible. They're in the motors of electric vehicles, the guidance systems of precision missiles, the screens of smartphones, wind turbines, MRI machines, and essentially every advanced electronic system that defines contemporary life. The United States Geological Survey has identified at least 25 different rare earth elements and critical minerals in Greenland's geology. A 2023 assessment by the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland valued potential rare earth deposits in the Kvanefjeld region alone at over $10 billion. But that's just one site. When you account for the full mineral wealth across the territory, including uranium, zinc, lead, iron ore, and potentially massive offshore oil and natural gas reserves, you're looking at resource value that could reach into the trillions over the coming decades. Here's the strategic problem that keeps Pentagon planners awake at night. China currently controls roughly 70% of global rare earth production and nearly 90% of rare earth processing capacity. This isn't an accident of geology. This is the result of deliberate Chinese industrial policy that began in the 1990s. While Western companies abandoned rare earth mining as unprofitable and environmentally problematic, China's state-backed enterprises absorbed the costs, accepted the environmental damage, and built a stranglehold on materials that are absolutely essential to modern military hardware. Let me put this in concrete terms. Every F-35 fighter jet requires approximately 920 pounds of rare earth materials. Every Virginia-class submarine needs roughly 9,200 pounds. The guidance systems, radar arrays, electronic warfare suites, and communications equipment that give American forces their technological edge all depend on these elements. And right now, a significant portion of those materials flow through Chinese supply chains that could be severed tomorrow if Beijing decides that's in its strategic interest. This isn't hypothetical. In 2010, during a territorial dispute with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, China quietly restricted rare earth exports to Japanese manufacturers. Prices spiked. Supply chains froze. The message was received. Resource dependence is strategic vulnerability. The same playbook could be deployed against the United States or any NATO ally during a future crisis over Taiwan, the South China Sea, or any other flashpoint where American and Chinese interests collide. Greenland represents the most viable path to breaking that dependency. The island's rare earth deposits are substantial, geologically accessible, and crucially, they're located in a jurisdiction friendly to Western interests. Energy Transition Minerals, an Australian company, has been developing the Kvanefjeld project. Greenland Minerals has been exploring multiple sites, but progress has been slow, hampered by environmental concerns, opposition from local communities worried about uranium contamination, and the simple economic reality that competing with China's state-subsidized production is extraordinarily difficult for private companies operating under Western environmental and labor standards. This is where American strategic interest becomes crystal clear. If Greenland's resources could be developed under a framework that provides both environmental protection and strategic security of supply, it would fundamentally alter the global balance in critical materials. It would give the United States and its allies an alternative to Chinese supply chains. It would create economic opportunities in an allied territory. And it would ensure that the technologies defining 21st century warfare and commerce aren't dependent on the goodwill of a strategic competitor. But the mineral wealth is only one dimension of Greenland's importance. The second is military geography, and this is where Cold War history becomes extremely relevant again. During World War II, the United States recognized Greenland's strategic position and established a presence there to prevent Nazi Germany from using the island as a base. That presence never fully left. Thule Air Base, located in northwest Greenland about 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle, has been continuously operated by the U.S. Air Force since 1951. It's home to the 12th Space Warning Squadron, which operates a ballistic missile early warning system that scans the skies for incoming ICBMs. Any nuclear attack on North America from Russia would be detected first at Thule. The base also supports the Space Force's satellite tracking and space surveillance mission. For decades, Thule was primarily about early warning, a lonely, frozen outpost that played a critical but unglamorous role in nuclear deterrence. That mission hasn't changed, but the strategic environment around Greenland has transformed dramatically. The Arctic is melting. That's not a political statement. It's an observable fact with massive geopolitical implications. Retreating ice is opening new shipping routes, creating access to previously unreachable resources, and turning the Arctic Ocean into contested maritime space for the first time in human history. The northern sea route along Russia's Arctic coast could reduce shipping time between Asia and Europe by 40% compared to the Suez Canal route. The Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic archipelago offers similar potential. Russia has been positioning itself for this reality for years. Moscow has reopened Soviet-era military bases across its Arctic frontier, built new icebreakers, and established a permanent military presence designed to control access to northern shipping lanes and offshore resources. China, despite being a non-Arctic nation, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and invested heavily in Arctic research, infrastructure in Iceland and Norway, and resource development partnerships with Russia. Greenland sits at the western edge of this emerging Arctic theater. Control of Greenland means control of the approaches to these new strategic waterways. It means the ability to monitor and, if necessary, interdict maritime traffic between the Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean. It means positioning for the resource competition that's already beginning as offshore drilling becomes viable in previously ice-covered waters. The Danish government, to its credit, has recognized these realities and has been modernizing its Arctic capabilities. But Denmark is a small nation with limited resources. Its military budget is roughly $5 billion annually. The kinds of surveillance systems, naval presence, and infrastructure investment required to genuinely secure Greenland in a contested Arctic environment run into the tens of billions. Resources Denmark simply doesn't have. This is the context in which American strategic interest must be understood. It's not about colonialism or 19th-century empire building. It's about ensuring that the critical geography and resources of the Arctic don't fall under the influence or control of powers whose interests fundamentally diverge from those of the United States and its allies. Now let's talk about what this means economically, because the strategic implications translate directly into market dynamics, inflation pressures, and ultimately the costs you face in your daily life. Rare earth prices are notoriously volatile, and that volatility is a direct function of Chinese supply decisions. In 2011, following the Japan export restrictions, prices for some rare earth oxides increased by over 700% in a matter of months. Neodymium oxide went from around $50 per kilogram to over $350. Manufacturers scrambled. Supply chains broke. Costs were passed along to consumers. Then, just as quickly, China increased production, and prices collapsed, bankrupting Western rare earth projects that had been launched during the price spike. This cycle has repeated itself multiple times over the past 15 years, and it's a textbook example of strategic market manipulation. By controlling both the supply and the price, China can make Western rare earth mining economically unviable whenever it chooses, ensuring continued dependency. The only way to break this cycle is through strategic investment that's insulated from short-term market fluctuations, exactly the kind of investment that requires government backing or guarantees. If Greenland's rare earth deposits were developed with American or Allied government support, it would stabilize these supply chains and reduce price volatility. That matters for electric vehicle production, which is central to Western climate commitments. It matters for defense production, which is critical as the United States ramps up military aid to allies and rebuilds depleted weapons stocks. And it matters for consumer electronics, where rare earth supply constraints translate directly into higher prices for everything from laptops to refrigerators. There's also the energy dimension. Greenland's offshore areas are believed to contain substantial oil and natural gas reserves. The U.S. Geological Survey estimated in 2008 that the waters off northeast Greenland could hold up to 31 billion barrels of oil and 86 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Those numbers are speculative, and the environmental challenges of Arctic drilling are immense. But in a world where energy security has returned as a central strategic concern, as Europe learned painfully after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the potential for additional non-OPEC, non-Russian hydrocarbon supplies in Allied territory is strategically significant. The European energy crisis that followed the Ukraine invasion sent natural gas prices soaring to record levels, drove inflation across the continent, and forced governments to spend hundreds of billions on emergency energy subsidies to prevent economic collapse. That crisis was fundamentally about dependency. Dependency on Russian natural gas that Moscow used as a weapon. Greenland's energy resources, if developed, would provide another option, another source of supply that doesn't come with geopolitical strings attached. This brings us to the inflation question that's on everyone's mind. Global supply chains are reconfiguring around strategic resilience rather than pure cost efficiency. That process is inherently inflationary in the short term. Moving rare earth processing out of China, developing new mines in Greenland or North America, building domestic manufacturing capacity for critical components, all of this costs money and time. Those costs show up as higher prices. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is continued vulnerability to supply disruptions, continued price volatility driven by foreign decisions, and continued strategic dependency on nations that may not share Western interests. The market is already pricing in these risks. Defense contractors are paying premiums for secured rare earth supplies. Electric vehicle manufacturers are investing in upstream mining projects. These aren't charity. They're recognition that supply chain security is worth paying for. From a market perspective, companies positioned in the rare earth supply chain, mining equipment manufacturers, and Arctic infrastructure developers are seeing significant investor interest. But this isn't advice to rush into speculative mining stocks. The history of rare earth investing is littered with failed companies and disappointed investors. The sector is highly technical, capital-intensive, and subject to both geological risk and political interference. What's different now is the level of government attention and the recognition that critical mineral supply chains are a national security issue, not just a commercial one. The U.S. Defense Production Act has been invoked to support rare earth projects. The Inflation Reduction Act includes provisions for critical mineral development. These aren't market interventions in the traditional sense. They're strategic investments in supply chain resilience. Now let's address the obvious question. Is the United States actually going to purchase Greenland? Almost certainly not in any conventional sense. Denmark has made clear that Greenland isn't for sale, and Greenland's own government has expressed no interest in becoming American territory. But that framing misses the real dynamic at play. What's far more likely is an expansion of the existing strategic partnership between the United States, Denmark, and Greenland that addresses American security interests while respecting Greenlandic autonomy and Danish sovereignty. That could take many forms: expanded American investment in Greenland's infrastructure and resource development, enhanced military cooperation beyond Thule Air Base, joint Arctic surveillance and research programs, or security guarantees that formalize American commitment to defending Greenland against external pressure. In fact, this is already happening. In 2020, the United States reopened a consulate in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, the first time in decades that America has had permanent diplomatic representation on the island. The State Department expanded economic development assistance to Greenland. American companies increased their engagement with Greenlandic resource projects. All of this signals a deepening relationship that doesn't require a change in sovereignty to achieve American strategic objectives. The more significant question is whether China will be allowed to gain economic and eventually political influence in Greenland. Chinese companies have expressed interest in mining projects, infrastructure development, and even building airports in Greenland. In 2018, Denmark and the United States successfully pressured Greenland to reject Chinese financing for airport expansion projects, offering alternative Western financing instead. That episode demonstrated the competition at play and the willingness of both Denmark and the United States to actively counter Chinese economic penetration. This is the new reality of great power competition. It's not tanks rolling across borders, at least not in most cases. It's infrastructure deals, mining contracts, investment frameworks, and the slow accumulation of economic dependencies that can be leveraged into political influence. China has deployed this strategy globally through the Belt and Road Initiative. The Arctic is simply the latest theater. For American strategic planners, Greenland represents both an opportunity and a test case. The opportunity is to secure access to critical resources and strategic geography before competitors do. The test case is whether the United States can effectively compete with Chinese state-backed economic engagement using tools other than military presence. There are historical parallels worth considering. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, about $140 million in today's currency. At the time, critics called it Seward's folly, after Secretary of State William Seward, who negotiated the deal. The purchase seemed like a waste of money for a frozen wilderness. That perspective didn't age well. Alaska's strategic position proved invaluable during World War II and the Cold War. Its oil reserves, discovered at Prudhoe Bay in 1968, transformed American energy security. Its mineral resources have generated billions in economic value. The lesson isn't that the United States should purchase Greenland. The lesson is that strategic geography and resource endowments that seem marginal or expensive in the moment can prove decisively important over decades. The investments that secure access to those assets, whether through purchase, partnership, or protection, pay dividends far beyond their immediate cost. We're at the beginning of a fundamental reorganization of global economic and strategic relationships. The era of assuming that markets alone would provide access to critical resources, that geography didn't matter in an age of globalization, that strategic competition was a relic of history. That era is over. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's economic coercion of trading partners, the fragility of supply chains revealed during the pandemic, all of these have forced a recalculation. Greenland is a test of whether democracies can think strategically about resources and geography the way authoritarian states do, while still respecting sovereignty, environmental standards, and the interests of local populations. It's a test of whether the United States can move beyond short-term thinking and invest in capabilities and relationships that will matter in 2050, not just in the next quarterly earnings report. The veterans of Cold War strategy, people like former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger before his death, and Condoleezza Rice, former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, strategic thinkers who cut their teeth on great power competition, have been making the case for years that the Arctic is the new frontier of geopolitical contest. They've argued that resource security, particularly for rare earth elements, is as important to 21st century power as oil was to 20th century power. And they've warned that China's patient, long-term strategy of securing access to critical resources and strategic geography is fundamentally reshaping the global balance. The question for America and its allies is whether we're willing to make the investments, accept the costs, and think with the kind of strategic patience that this competition demands. Greenland is not the only theater where this question arises, but it may be the clearest test case, a place where resource wealth, strategic geography, and the interests of allies and partners converge in a way that demands action rather than just analysis. The ice is melting. The resources are real. The strategic competition is intensifying. And Greenland, whether it becomes American territory or remains a Danish realm with deepened American partnership, will be central to how that competition unfolds. The decisions made in the next few years about investment, development, and strategic cooperation will echo for decades. History suggests we should take those decisions seriously. If this analysis changed how you see global resource competition and strategic geography, share it with someone who needs to understand what's really at stake in the Arctic. The mainstream coverage misses the depth of what's happening here. And if you want investigations like this that connect the dots between strategy, markets, and the forces reshaping your economic future, subscribe and turn on notifications. The stories that matter most are the ones that don't fit into easy narratives, and that's exactly what we cover here.